In today's story, two beloved elderly men welcomed a guest into their home. Days later, their dismembered remains were found, leaking from suitcases on the famous Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol. This is the horrifying true story of betrayal, brutality, and the killer hiding in plain sight. In the early morning hours of 8th of July 2024, a 71-year-old Paul Longworth was sitting in his house in Shepherd's Bush in London. Paul, who was born and bred in the United Kingdom, was always an early riser, and so he was already in his favourite chair drinking a cup of tea. He could have been enjoying his retirement years, but Paul decided to stay active by being a handyman and helping people around him with fixing whatever needed mending. Not only did this provide Paul with cash in hand, but it was also giving him access to even more daily interactions with people, which he absolutely adored. Anyone that knew Paul said that he and his civil partner, Alfonso, were always among the favourite of neighbours. They were a good laugh and were always happy to stop and chat with just about anyone. The couple were also described as being very happy and cheerful, but also quiet. And so no wonder that over those 30 years of them living in their house of 9 Scots Road in London, they became a great addition to the community. Paul looked up and saw that his partner Albert was now walking towards the kitchen. Albert, who was originally French and 9 years younger than Paul, was also still employed. He worked as a swimming instructor at the Moat Gym in Acton, and just like Paul, Albert was always looking forward to his shifts at the gym. He loved staying fit, and wherever possible, he would ride his bike to keep on top of his cardio. Paul and Albert had been together for many years. They had known one another since a very young age and developed a very special bond because they came from foster families. So, what started as a simple friendship, over the years, the couple developed a very loving bond. And even though they were not involved romantically and slept in separate bedrooms, in February 2023, the couple decided to enter into civil partnership together. Paul was also relying on Albert a lot since he was dyslexic, and so Albert would care for and help Paul wherever he could. That day, Albert was scheduled to work at the gym from 5 a.m. till 2 p.m, and so he wanted to grab a quick shake and then head into work. Paul smiled at Albert and handed him his protein shake that he had already made, and so Albert said thank you and soon was walking out of their home. Paul, on the other hand, was not scheduled to work until about 11 o'clock that morning. He was going to cut some trees for a neighbour a few houses over, and so for now, Paul put his empty mug into the sink, shuffled over to the bedroom, and set his alarm clock for later on. Little did he know that this would be actually the last time he would get a chance to do that, and that soon enough, very disturbing headlines would be circulating the press. 2 days later, in the evening of 10th of July, a man with 2 large suitcases was seen being dropped off at the pub near the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol. This caught the eyes of 2 people who were leaving the pub, and so they approached him to offer him some help. The man, who was described as black with slender figure and a beard, introduced himself as Juan and proceeded to use Google Translate to say that he was actually transporting some mechanical parts and oil, and that he needed to get this to the suspension bridge. This bridge is an important historical landmark of the city and a truly beautiful piece of Victorian architecture. The couple tried helping him, but the suitcases were just too large and heavy to fit into their own car, and so they offered to call him taxi instead. Meanwhile, this scene attracted even more eyes, and that is because this trio was really struggling to move this luggage. Another man thought of going over to help them, and so he approached them and jokingly said, this looks very heavy, what have you got in there, a body? But to his surprise, nobody laughed. Instead, the woman, who was still struggling to get her grip onto one of the suitcases, said that she had never carried anything so heavy before, and so, perhaps there could be a body in there. After a few moments, the taxi arrived, and so with all their might, the suitcases were loaded in. The drive was very short, and so a couple of minutes later, the man was being dropped off at the suspension bridge, deciding what to do next. He knew that he couldn't carry both of the suitcases himself, and so he decided to leave the smaller silver bag in the lay-by and proceeded to drag the larger red suitcase onto the bridge's pavement. There he tried lifting it up, but it was just too heavy for him to do that. The suspension bridge is staffed, which is presumably something that the man didn't know. And so the staff, sitting in the little office at the beginning of the bridge, were watching this man closely. But the whole scene was just making no sense to them. Why would anyone want to bring 2 large heavy suitcases with them onto the bridge? As the man was trying to lift one of the pieces up, the staff walked over to him and asked what was going on. And when they did, this man, again using the Google Translate, said that he was just waiting on a friend, and the staff just kind of let him to it. Being a little more cautious, the man then decided to leave the red luggage on the sidewalk and return for his second luggage. But that is when a cyclist was actually passing him by, and he noticed a strange red liquid oozing from the red luggage. So the cyclist stopped, and in Spanish, he began asking the man what he was doing there and actually requested to see what was inside of the bag. This also ended up alerting the staff of the bridge, and so they walked over to the man, and they could now also see that the luggage was now standing in a pool of red liquid. And at this point, the black man realized what the others were looking at, and so he decided to just run for it. The cyclist immediately hopped onto his bike and decided to follow him. He even managed to record his chase on his phone, but when the cyclist tried stopping the runner, he shoved the cyclist onto the ground, knocking his phone out of his hand, and ran away into the darkness. Back at the bridge, the police were finally called in to come and investigate the suitcases. 2 police officers arrived within 10 minutes, but the man was already gone. So they started securing the area just in case there was something dangerous within the bags, but nothing could prepare them for what they were about to discover. Inside both of the bags were human remains, cut, packed, and hidden in the most disturbing fashion. Each suitcase contained a pair of arms and legs with removed head, torso, hands, and feet. This could mean only one thing. They were looking at the remains of at least 2 victims. Clifton Bridge was immediately closed and a full-scale homicide investigation began. Even though that this case was just in its beginning, it was already drawing the attention of the media and public. Witnesses were coming forward with the description of the black man who had been seen on the bridge, and the actual footage from the cyclist was also handed in. This helped the police to release an image, and so at least now the investigators had something more tangible to go on, and they knew that they needed to find that man quickly. In the meantime, the suitcases helped the investigators track down the address of the victims. This turned out to be the location relatively far away in London, and sadly it would turn out that the flat belonged to the elderly pair of Albert Alfonso and Paul Longworth. But this nightmare was far away from being over. Inside of the flat, stashed away in a freezer, the investigators found the missing heads, torsos, hands, and feet. The coroner concluded that the body parts had been removed with a knife. The cuts and stab wounds were identical, meaning they were all done with the same knife and by the same person. And this was pointing to something very chilling. These murders felt very personal, as if the victims knew the killer intimately. And so the question now everyone began asking was, who could do these to the elderly man? But it turned out that the answer came much faster than anyone expected. Quickly, attention turned to Yostin Mosquera, a 35-year-old Colombian. He had actually been staying with Albert and Paul, and on the night of discovery, CCTV caught him leaving the flat with 2 suitcases. Mosquera was then arrested on July 13 at Bristol Temple Meat Station as he was attempting to flee. He was found wearing only 1 shoe, and his red t-shirt was stained with blood. Just 2 days later, Mosquera was charged with 2 counts of murder. The prosecutors pointed out that the murders were most likely motivated by hate, targeting the victims for their sexual orientation and past relationship. At the same time, the police issued a statement that they were not pursuing actually any other individuals in this case, and that the only suspect was indeed Mosquera. In a surprising court appearance, Mosquera pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Albert Alfonso, but denied murdering either of the men. The prosecution rejected the plea and started pushing forward with a murder trial. This was set out to begin on April 14, 2025, but it ended up being moved to the April 30th. And even though the trial is still ongoing, it's already relieved some very chilling and disturbing details. And so here is exactly what happened to Paul and Albert on 8th of July 2024. While both men went to work, Mosquera was actually casually browsing the internet back at Paul's and Albert's flat. He had been staying with the elderly couple for a short while. Mosquera met Albert via a pornographic site, where Mosquera allegedly posed as a porn actor. The pair started chatting online first, but in October 2023, Albert invited Mosquera to join him and another user from the same website for an intimate session, which was followed by a sightseeing tour around London. Just 2 months later, Mosquera filmed an adult video for Albert, which was then followed by another one in May 2024. The pair ended up meeting yet again in June and July of 2024. And I don't want to go into too many details about the nature of their meetups because I feel like this is exactly what people would take from this story. Some might then even suggest that Albert was actually the one to blame for what happened to him and Paul later on, and that is the last thing I would ever want. Having said that, it feels important to mention that these sexual practices were not exactly ordinary. They also involved a certain level of degradation and humiliation of Albert's part. Now, Paul was aware and accepting of this part of Albert's life, but he was actually not involved in any of the sexual activities himself. But he did go on visiting Mosquera with Albert back in his homeland of Colombia. And so there he was. Mosquera was browsing the web for terms like chest freezers on Facebook Marketplace, house sale of 9 Scots Road, and where on the head a knock would be fatal. I think these all give you a very chilling insight into what happened next. Mosquera also checked himself into his flight back to Colombia, accessed several porn sites, and was then caught on a CCTV camera looking out through the curtains of the flat. Just before 12:30 p.m, Paul returned home. But as soon as he walked into the door, out of nowhere, Mosquera came charging at him with a hammer. Paul had no time to run, as he was completely taken by surprise, which is exactly what Mosquera was counting on. As the attacker was savagely striking Paul over his head and neck, Paul tried protecting himself by raising his arms, but to no avail. Mosquera was much quicker and stronger than him, and so Paul would soon collapse from his injuries without ever seeing his lifelong partner Albert again. The coroner would later disclose that Paul had died of severe blunt force trauma to the head, and there were further 9 areas of injury to his back and top of the head. These resulted in Paul's skin to tear and his skull to crack, embedding the bone fragments into his brain. Paul also had cuts and bruises found on his thumb and little finger, which were ruled as clear types of defensive injuries. When the flat was searched, the authorities found the murder weapon lying on the floor of the hallway, stained with Paul's blood. Mosquera was seen to be closing the curtains just before 12:30 p.m, and so it is believed that Paul was actually killed sometimes between 12:30 and 1 p.m. After Mosquera checked that Paul was indeed deceased, he lifted his body and shifted it into the victim's bedroom. He then lifted the mattress and placed Paul's body into the bed frame. He then grabbed a few towels and started wiping the blood spatter off the floor, walls, and even ceiling. After he was satisfied that his tracks were covered, he washed the blood of himself in the bathroom, opened the curtains up, and then the killer sat down to wait for Albert to come home. The second man came back home just shortly after 2 p.m, but he ended up actually leaving at 5 p.m. to go back to the gym again. While Albert was out, Mosquera downloaded his boarding pass and made some more haunting web searches on the topic of how long before a corpse starts to decompose. Albert returned home from the gym at around 7:30 p.m. He greeted Mosquera, and while having dinner, he asked whether he had seen Paul because his partner should have been home by now. Mosquera just shook his head, and so Albert didn't question him any further on that. Later in the evening, at around 10 p.m, Albert and Mosquera became involved in yet another sexual act. Again, I'm not going to go into all the details of what actually happened between the two, but like the previous sessions, it was rather extreme and it involved levels of humiliation, with Mosquera being the dominant figure. But so far, all of this was consensual. A few minutes later, Mosquera stopped and went on to get a knife to cut a piece of duct tape with it. But when he came back, he straddled Albert, grabbed him by the hair and pulled his back up and pressed the cold blade into Albert's neck. And at this point, Albert realized that something was wrong. Knife play had never really been a part of their sessions before, and so in panic, Albert tried getting away from the man. But Mosquera was much younger and fitter than him, and so he overpowered the man very quickly. And he began stabbing him and asking him whether he liked that. Mosquera would then push his second victim onto the bed and cut his throat. In the post-mortem report, the coroner described that Albert had 13 stab wounds across his arms and torso, and another 9 on his face and neck. There were also multiple defend wounds, as Albert was desperately trying to save himself. As the second victim was dying, Mosquera got up and started singing and dancing around the corpse. He then, still naked, logged onto the Albert's PC and started looking up information about Albert's life. The killer tried sending £4,000 to his bank account back in Colombia, but when that was unsuccessful, he grabbed Albert's debit card and left the flat to make some cash withdrawals of around £900, but they soon started getting declined. Over the next couple of days, the killer purchased a freezer and then began dismembering both men's corpses. He hid half of the remains in the freezer itself and then crammed the rest into the 2 suitcases, which he then transported to Bristol by hiring a man with a van. The killer also tried disposing of multiple sex toys, the bloodstained knife, and electronic devices in the communal bins. The 2 suitcases would of course be then found shortly after the killer tried disposing of them, and he himself would be arrested on the 13th of July. But this story has one more chilling twist. Albert liked to film his sexual acts, and so there were multiple cameras installed around his bedroom. And when Mosquera and Albert were having sex that evening, the cameras were actually on, recording everything that was happening, meaning they also recorded the brutal murder. In this footage, which was also shown during the trial, not only is Mosquera clearly seen murdering Albert, but the killer also remains calm and in control during the whole heinous act. It looked as if Mosquera was absolutely not bothered by any of what he had just done. But even with all of this evidence in place, Mosquera still tried pleading not guilty to killing either man. He pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Albert because he said that he just lost control. But he also tried suggesting that Albert had actually killed Paul himself, and so he had nothing to do with that murder. The prosecution, of course, rejected this and pushed for the trial, which actually began on the 30th of April and is set to last approximately 3 weeks. Now, the question that everybody is asking is, why did Mosquera kill? Was it rage, mental instability, or calculated malice? Upon inspecting Mosquera's browsing history, it was full of details about Jack the Ripper film, serial killers of London, house prices, porn sites, freezers, industrial blenders, and also searches about the maximum withdrawal amounts, as well as accessing Albert's hard drive with financial spreadsheets. And these records were actually going back months. So to the prosecutor, it was clear that these murders were being pre-planned, and that Mosquera was actually focusing on the financial gain. Now, some other questions remain unanswered. We still don't know why Mosquera actually decided to transport those bodies to Bristol. It is clear that he wanted to dispose of them by throwing them off the bridge, but the rails and the tall mesh prevented him from doing that. But equally, if he was just after disposing of the bodies, there are rivers and bridges in London, and so why not just do that? The flat itself was found blood-soaked and full of DNA evidence, and that is not even mentioning the footage, so it was inevitable that Mosquera would be found sooner than later. So why go through all that trouble and not fly out to Colombia sooner? Another question that comes to mind is whether these murders could have been prevented. Were there perhaps warning signs that friends, neighbors, or authorities missed? Mosquera is not known to have a history of severe violence, but he had been described as troubled and unpredictable. The relationship between the three men also remains shrouded in secrecy. Some say that it was strained, and some others argued that it was all about control. A highly interesting piece of information came from the man who had been invited to join Albert and Mosquera in a sexual act back in October 23. This man, under the pseudonym of James Smith, confessed that Albert had taped one of their sessions and then promised to not share it with anyone if Smith continued to do him sexual favors. So there could have been blackmail going on, and perhaps Mosquera saw no other way of getting out, or he simply wanted revenge. It also could have been all just a false pretense, and Mosquera was just after Albert's money. After all, he gained their full trust. They had traveled back into his home country, they had hosted him several times, and now Mosquera was even staying with them for several weeks. So I'm sure that they never could have imagined that Mosquera could have turned on them like that. Of course, the nature of Albert met with this killer is also worth mentioning. We all know that you can't just trust anyone you meet on the internet, and you have to be extremely careful, especially if you're inviting them into your own home. There are a lot of people interested in such practices that Albert was involved in, and I'm sure that many of those people are perfectly harmless. But it is still a very dangerous territory, and so in those waters you really cannot stay vigilant enough. Albert, Alfonso, and Paul Longworth deserved a peace in their final years. Instead, their lives ended in terror, with their remains discarded in a public place of beauty and history. Justice is now in the hands of the courts, as the trial is still continuing. But I hope that the verdict will be nothing less than life in prison for this monster. If this story moved you, then please share it and subscribe. And remember, stay safe and look out for one another. Until next time.